Have you ever wondered why some older men are just done? Why they've completely shut off their emotional bank accounts, giving nothing more to women who've contributed nothing in return? Well, the brutal truth is about to be laid out. We've all heard the stories, the whispers in locker rooms, the late-night conversations where older men finally break their silence about what they've endured in relationships. And let me tell you, these stories aren't pretty. They're raw, they're honest, and they may just change the way you view relationships. You see, when you've lived a few decades, you've seen it all: the games, the manipulation, the one-sided relationships that drain you. And it gets to a point where you simply stop giving. The problem isn't just that men are tired. It's that they've been giving their all for years, only to be met with indifference, neglect, or worse, exploitation. And no matter how hard they try, they realize that nothing ever truly changes. They're left feeling as if they've invested so much energy, love, and patience, only to be met with an empty return. Let's talk about John Miller, a man in his mid-60s. John, like many others, gave everything to a marriage that ended in divorce. He spent decades building a life for his family, sacrificed his time, his health, and his own happiness for the sake of his relationship. But in the end, it all fell apart. His wife took what she could, and when the relationship ended, she took even more. John's story is far from unique. Men like him spent their prime years investing in relationships that gave nothing back. And when they're done, they're done. They reach a point where they've been let down too many times to keep believing in the fairy tale. They've seen the signs. They've felt the betrayal. And now, they're tired. Tired of giving, tired of expecting, tired of hoping. For older men, there's this moment, a tipping point, if you will. It's when the years of putting others first finally take their toll. They're not just physically exhausted, they're emotionally drained. They've been in relationships where they gave everything, only to receive little to nothing in return. And at some point, they wake up to the fact that they've been used, not loved. The sad truth is, many women still don't understand this shift. They still expect the same kind of emotional investment, the same kind of commitment, the same kind of sacrifice. But the older man is no longer willing to play that game. He's reached the end of his emotional rope, and he's not going to keep giving to someone who doesn't appreciate it. It's a hard truth to swallow, but it's the reality for so many older men who've been burned one too many times. It's not about being bitter or angry. It's about self-preservation. At some point, every older man has to ask himself, what have I truly gained from all of this? And the answer, more often than not, is nothing. So, when they say they're done, believe them. They've given all they can, and it's time for them to focus on themselves, to protect what little emotional energy they have left. The brutal truth is, older men are no longer willing to invest in relationships that drain them without any return. And until women understand this, the cycle will continue. It's hard for John Miller to admit, but after years of giving it all in relationships, he's reached his breaking point. The story of John's life isn't all that different from many older men. Men who have spent the best years of their lives giving everything to a partner, only to be left with emptiness. For decades, John thought that if he kept sacrificing for his partner, kept pushing through the struggles, love would eventually prevail. But as the years passed, he found himself worn out, with little to show for it. When his marriage ended in divorce, there was no comfort, no closure, just a pile of regret. His wife walked away with more than he did, and not just financially. She took the emotional energy he'd spent years investing, and she didn't even seem to notice it. John wasn't bitter, not in the way you'd think. No, he was just tired. Tired of being the one who always gave, tired of putting someone else's needs before his own. And when he tried to talk about it, when he tried to express the exhaustion, no one understood. People just didn't get it. They didn't see that the man who had always been there, the man who had always given everything, was now at the edge of his rope. The truth is, John isn't alone. Men like him are. Scattered all over, living with the quiet pain of years spent in relationships that drained them. Many of them will tell you they never got back what they put in. They'll tell you they've tried to love, tried to make it work, but at some point, they realized that love was a one-way street. They had been investing in relationships where their needs were ignored, where their efforts went unrecognized. And eventually, they stopped trying. John's story is the story of so many older men who've reached the same conclusion. It's not that they're giving up on love. It's that they've given all they can, and no one ever noticed. The truth is, men of John's generation were raised to be providers, to put others first, to sacrifice for their family. And for years, that's exactly what they did. But somewhere along the way, they were never asked how they were feeling. They were never asked what they needed. Instead, they were expected to give more, to continue the cycle of selflessness, while their emotional needs were pushed aside. The emotional bank account of men like John is empty. There's no more left to give, and there's no more willingness to keep sacrificing. It's not about being selfish, it's about survival. When you've given everything and received nothing in return, the only thing left is to protect yourself. You learn the hard way that you can't keep giving to someone who doesn't care. You learn that the emotional toll of putting others before yourself can leave you hollow. It's not easy for John to admit, but he's done. He's not angry, not resentful, he's just done. He doesn't need to explain it to anyone because he's reached a point where he knows he deserves more. And what's worse, when older men like John try to find something better, they're often met with the same expectations they left behind. They're expected to keep giving, to keep providing, to keep doing the emotional heavy lifting. But they know better now. They know that they've given enough. And they're not going to keep putting their energy into relationships that drain them without any return. John's life is a wake-up call, not just for him, but for anyone who's willing to listen. It's a brutal truth that many older men are discovering. You can't keep giving everything to someone who gives nothing. And at some point, you have to put yourself first. You have to recognize that you deserve more, that you've earned the right to live your life without the constant pressure to sacrifice your happiness for someone else's. It's not selfish, it's self-preservation. As John Miller continued to reflect on the years he spent giving everything, he started to realize just how deep the wounds of his past had become. He wasn't angry at his ex-wife anymore. In fact, there was no room left for anger. There was only exhaustion, an emotional fatigue that had slowly crept up on him over time. It wasn't just the divorce that drained him. It was the years of investing, of giving all his time, energy, and heart, only to watch it slip away without any recognition. He had hoped, like so many men before him, that if he just kept going, kept giving, things would change. But they didn't. And now, at 64, John found himself in a place he never thought he'd be, alone and realizing that the years of sacrifice had left him with nothing to show for it. When John met other men in similar situations, he began to see a pattern. These were men who had spent decades working hard, building lives, families, and careers, and yet, when the dust settled, they were left to pick up the pieces. They had given so much and received so little. It wasn't just the financial costs or the emotional toll of divorce. It was the constant feeling of being overlooked, of being unappreciated. Men like John weren't used to asking for help, but in the quiet moments, when they reflected on their past, they realized they had given too much and gotten nothing in return. For years, they believed in the narrative of love and partnership, that they were supposed to be the providers, the protectors, the ones who held it all together. But now, they were discovering the hard truth. They had neglected their own needs for too long, and no one had asked if they were okay. It's not that these men didn't want to love or be loved. They did, but they were no longer willing to repeat the cycle of giving everything with no return. They had been there, done that, and they weren't interested in going through it again. John often thought back to the early days of his marriage. He remembered when he and his ex-wife were young, when they had dreams, when the world seemed full of possibilities. Back then, he never thought about the future in terms of sacrifice. He thought about building a life together. But somewhere along the way, that vision had been lost. The sacrifices he made weren't shared, they were expected. His wife had her own life, her own goals, and he had always put her needs before his. He never complained. After all, that's what a husband does, right? But over time, those sacrifices began to wear on him. They wore on his spirit, on his health, and on his patience. The more he gave, the more he felt drained. And yet, his efforts were never fully acknowledged. As the years passed, he began to feel more like a provider than a partner. And when the marriage ended, he realized just how much of himself had been lost in the process. John wasn't the only one. He had met other men, like David Green, who had lived similar lives. David had worked hard all his life, building a successful business and raising a family. But when his wife left him, he found himself wondering what he had to show for it. His business? His savings? They didn't mean anything anymore. They weren't going to bring him happiness, not the kind he needed. What he needed was companionship, respect, and the love he had given away for so long. But like John, David felt like he had given all he could. His emotional reserves were depleted. He was left wondering if he would ever feel that connection again. John and David were just two examples, but there were countless others, all facing the same harsh reality. As they shared their stories, they realized that they had all been conditioned to believe in the idea of selflessness, of giving without expecting. But at some point, the toll becomes too great. They had invested everything they had into relationships that drained them, and now they had nothing left to give. And that, perhaps, was the hardest part. The realization that they were no longer capable of giving more, not because they didn't want to, but because they had simply run out of emotional capital. So what did that mean for men like John? It meant they had to change the way they approach relationships. It meant understanding that their needs mattered too, and that self-preservation wasn't a selfish act, but a necessary one. For John, the brutal truth was that he could no longer keep giving to a relationship that wasn't giving him anything in return. And it was time for him to focus on his own well-being. This wasn't about bitterness, and it wasn't about giving up on love altogether. It was about knowing when to stop and protecting what little emotional energy he had left. As the months went by, John Miller began to notice something important. His life, though quieter than it had been during his marriage, started to feel more fulfilling. It wasn't about being alone. It was about finding peace in his own company. He wasn't constantly trying to meet someone else's needs or expectations. For the first time in decades, he wasn't focused on keeping the peace or sacrificing his own desires. He could breathe. He could think. The emotional weight he had carried for so long had lifted, and it felt like a weight he hadn't realized was there. He had always believed that love meant giving everything you had, that it was a noble sacrifice. And for years, he had lived that way. But now, John realized that the real sacrifice was the one he had made for himself. He had given so much to others that he had forgotten to take care of himself. And when he finally started focusing on his own well-being, he saw just how much he had neglected his own needs. He began to explore his own interests, things he had put off for years. Whether it was picking up a hobby he had abandoned or taking trips to places he had always wanted to see, John felt a sense of freedom that he hadn't experienced in years. His focus had shifted from others to himself, and he felt stronger for it. But even as John started to find his footing, he couldn't help but notice the same patterns around him. Other men, older men, who had spent their lives giving everything to others, were starting to go through the same realization. It wasn't just him. The more he talked to his friends, like David Green, the more he heard the same stories. These men weren't angry, but they were all weary. They were men who had spent their youth, their prime years, pouring their hearts into relationships, careers, and families. And now, in their later years, they were left to deal with the consequences. Some of them had been divorced, some had never married, but all of them had one thing in common. They had been drained. They were emotionally spent. David had always been the reliable one, the one who everyone turned to for help. But when his marriage ended, he realized he had no one to turn to. All the years of emotional investment had left him with nothing. Like John, David was learning the importance of self-care. He had always believed that by taking care of others, he was fulfilling his role as a man. But now he realized that he had to take care of himself, too. He had to find his own happiness without relying on anyone else. John and David weren't alone in this journey. More and more older men were beginning to speak out about their experiences. They were starting to realize that they had been taught to sacrifice, to give without expecting anything in return. But now, they saw that this kind of thinking had only led them to exhaustion, loneliness, and regret. They had spent too many years trying to meet others' expectations and not enough time fulfilling their own needs. These men weren't bitter, and they weren't blaming others. They were simply acknowledging that they had been through a lot and that it was time for a change. It wasn't about abandoning love or relationships altogether, but it was about finding balance. These men wanted to be in relationships, but they didn't want to give everything without getting anything in return. They wanted their efforts to be recognized, their love to be appreciated, and most importantly, they wanted to feel valued. As John reflected on his own journey, he realized that the hardest part was not the loneliness or the pain of the past. It was the change in mindset. It was the shift from being the selfless giver to being someone who could finally say no when enough was enough. He had spent so many years thinking that love was about giving everything away, but now he knew better. He knew that love was a two-way street, and he was no longer willing to be the only one driving down it. This was a lesson that David had also learned, and as they shared their experiences, they began to understand the importance of self-respect. They realized that being there for others didn't mean sacrificing their own happiness. It meant finding a way to balance their needs with the needs of those around them. John knew that this wasn't a process that would happen overnight. It was something that took time, and it required a lot of self-reflection. But he was ready for it. He was ready to live a life where he no longer felt drained, where he no longer felt as if he had to give everything just to be loved. He knew that love would come when the time was right, but it had to be mutual. It had to be a love where both people contributed, where both people cared, and where both people were willing to sacrifice, not just one. John Miller had always believed in the value of hard work, the kind of work that made a man feel like he was truly contributing to something greater than himself. But over time, that belief had started to crumble. He'd spent so many years sacrificing, putting in the effort, but as he looked back, he realized that those sacrifices had left him feeling more isolated than ever. What had all the work really amounted to? His relationship with his ex-wife, once filled with hope and potential, had turned into a one-sided affair, one where he constantly gave and she only took. As he navigated life after the divorce, John began to see that the problem wasn't just in his past relationship, but in how he had approached every relationship. He had always been the one to make things work, to give in, to compromise, because that's what a good partner did, right? But it hadn't been enough. John knew that he was tired of giving everything without receiving anything in return. But what did that really mean for him moving forward? It meant change. It meant learning how to live life on his own terms, to stop giving in to every expectation, to stop sacrificing his own happiness for the sake of others. And it wasn't easy. After a lifetime of putting others before himself, it took time to rewire his thinking. At first, it felt selfish, but over time, John realized that focusing on his own happiness wasn't selfish at all. It was necessary for his well-being. It wasn't about avoiding relationships. It was about finding balance. John wasn't looking for perfection, but he was looking for a partnership, one where both sides contributed equally, where both partners respected each other's needs. And he wasn't going to settle for less anymore. One evening, over a beer with his old friend David Green, John shared his thoughts. "I used to think it was all about giving, doing the right thing," John said, swirling his drink. "But now, I see it was about survival. I gave so much of myself, and for what? I'm left with nothing but memories and a tired heart." David, who had been listening quietly, nodded slowly. He had been down a similar path, feeling the weight of years spent trying to make something work, only to end up with little to show for it. "I get it, man," David replied. "I thought I had to keep giving too. But you can't pour from an empty cup." The two men shared a quiet moment, their words unspoken but understood. Both had been on this journey of self-discovery, learning that self-care was not only important but essential. They realized that they didn't have to sacrifice their well-being for the sake of someone else's happiness. They were allowed to ask for what they needed, to set boundaries, and to stop feeling guilty for putting themselves first. It was a difficult transition, but it was a necessary one. John found that as he stopped overextending himself, he began to enjoy life more. He started to do things he had always wanted to do but had put off for years. Whether it was traveling, reconnecting with old friends, or simply enjoying quiet moments on his own, he was no longer bogged down by the weight of expectation. He wasn't looking for someone else to fill the emptiness. He was learning how to fill it for himself. He realized that he didn't need a partner to feel whole, and that realization was freeing. But he also knew that he wasn't giving up on love altogether. He still believed in love, in partnership. But now, he knew that love had to be mutual. It had to be a relationship where both partners contributed, where both partners respected each other's needs. No more one-sided relationships, no more putting in all the effort with nothing in return. David, too, began to shift his mindset. He started setting boundaries in his own life, learning that it wasn't just okay to say no, it was necessary. He wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. He understood that being single wasn't a failure, it was an opportunity for growth. And just like John, David learned that real love, the kind of love that mattered, had to come from a place of mutual respect and care. They both knew that this shift in mindset wasn't easy, and it wasn't instant. But it was worth it. As the months went by, John felt stronger. He wasn't the same man who had walked out of his marriage all those years ago, feeling broken and defeated. He was someone who had learned to live for himself, to prioritize his own happiness. And as he looked ahead, he realized that the future wasn't so scary anymore. It was full of possibilities. And this time, he was ready to embrace it on his own terms. John Miller's journey of self-discovery continued as he spent more time reflecting on his past and evaluating the kind of future he wanted. It wasn't just about healing from his past relationships or overcoming the emotional exhaustion he had experienced. It was about reclaiming his life, his energy, and his sense of purpose. He had spent years trying to live up to an ideal that wasn't even his own, constantly giving in relationships where he was the only one pouring in. But now, he was discovering that there was more to life than that. He began focusing on what truly made him happy. It wasn't always about grand adventures or extravagant moments. Sometimes, it was the small things. Waking up in the morning without the weight of someone else's expectations on his shoulders, enjoying a cup of coffee on his porch, or taking long walks through the park. These were moments of peace, moments where he could simply be himself. And as he embraced this newfound freedom, John noticed something remarkable. He started to feel a sense of joy that had been absent from his life for so long. He no longer felt burdened by the expectations of others. He had finally learned to take care of himself, to say no when needed, and to prioritize his own happiness. John wasn't seeking validation from anyone anymore. He didn't need someone to complete him. He was complete as he was. He realized that for years, he had placed his worth in the hands of others, waiting for their approval, their affection, or their gratitude. But now, he understood that his worth didn't depend on what others thought of him. It came from within. His self-worth was something he had to nurture and protect, not give away to others who were only interested in taking. But it wasn't just about being content alone. John didn't shut the door to future relationships. He knew that real love, the kind of love that was equal and reciprocal, was still possible. But he wasn't willing to settle for less anymore. He wouldn't enter another relationship where he was expected to give everything while getting nothing in return. His standards had changed. He wasn't looking for someone to fill the emptiness. He was looking for a true partnership. And if that didn't come, he was fine being on his own. Over time, John noticed that he was not the only one on this path. More and more older men were starting to share their own stories, and they were beginning to see things from a similar perspective. Men like David Green, who had spent years giving all they had, were waking up to the same realization. These men had been taught that being selfless was the right thing to do, that love meant giving without expecting anything in return. But now, they were learning that love, real love, was a two-way street. These men weren't bitter or jaded. They weren't angry at the women they had been with, but they were done being the ones who always gave, always sacrificed, always compromised. They had learned that to have a healthy relationship, there had to be balance. You couldn't keep giving without receiving, and you couldn't keep sacrificing your happiness for someone else's. This was a hard lesson for many of them, but it was an important one. John wasn't sure what the future held, but he was finally ready for whatever came next. He was ready to embrace it on his own terms. He was no longer afraid of being alone, but he wasn't closing himself off to the possibility of love either. He had learned that the right relationship would come when the time was right. It would be a relationship where both people gave and received equally, where both partners respected each other's needs, and where both were willing to put in the effort. John had learned that love was not just about being there for someone else. It was about being there for yourself first. When you value yourself, when you know your worth, the right relationship will come. And until then, it was okay to be on your own. It was okay to live life the way you wanted to, without the pressure to conform to someone else's expectations. John was finally free, and that freedom was worth everything. As John Miller settled into his new life, he found a sense of purpose that he hadn't realized he had been missing. He had always focused on making sure the needs of others were met, but now, for the first time, he was focusing on himself. It wasn't that he had given up on others, but rather, he had learned to prioritize his own happiness, and that made all the difference. John spent more time with people who truly valued him, who gave back as much as they took. His circle became smaller, but it was made up of people who respected his boundaries and understood the importance of mutual respect. He also began to explore new interests and rediscovered old passions. He joined a local book club, something he'd always wanted to do but never had the time for. He started taking weekend trips to places he had always dreamed of visiting, spending time in nature, and appreciating the simplicity of life. For the first time in a long time, John felt like he was living life on his terms. But the most significant change was in his perspective on relationships. He had spent years in a marriage where he gave everything, only to realize that it wasn't enough. He had loved deeply, but he had never received the same in return. He had been focused on what his partner needed, what was expected of him, and he had neglected his own needs in the process. Now, he understood that a healthy relationship wasn't about being selfless all the time. It was about balance, communication, and mutual effort. It wasn't that John had given up on love. Far from it. He still believed in the idea of partnership, but he was no longer willing to sacrifice his own happiness for someone else's. He wanted to be with someone who valued him as much as he valued them, someone who would share the weight of the relationship. As John started to embrace this new mindset, he began to notice the subtle ways his life was changing. He found himself feeling more confident, more content, and less anxious about the future. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long had been lifted, and he could finally breathe. He realized that it was okay to be alone, and that being with someone shouldn't feel like an obligation or a sacrifice. It should be a choice, a partnership where both people supported each other. John's life wasn't perfect, and he knew it never would be. But he had learned the importance of setting boundaries and recognizing when something wasn't right for him. He had learned that he was worth more than just being the one who gave, that he deserved to receive love and respect in return. His journey wasn't just about healing from past wounds. It was about growth, about finding peace with who he was and what he wanted moving forward. He had learned that self-care wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. As the days passed, John found himself in a better place emotionally, mentally, and physically. He wasn't looking for validation from others anymore. He had found that within himself. And while he still believed in love and partnership, he knew that he wouldn't settle for less. He wasn't going to repeat the same mistakes of the past. If love came into his life again, it would be because it was the right kind of love, a love that was mutual, respectful, and equal. John had learned that the most important relationship he could have was the one with himself. And once he understood that, he was ready to face whatever the future had in store. He knew that, whatever happened, he was in control of his own happiness. His life was his own to live, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As John Miller embraced his newfound freedom, he began to understand the importance of boundaries in every aspect of his life. For so long, he had allowed his personal space to be invaded, his needs to be neglected, and his voice to be silenced. Now he was reclaiming control. He was learning that it was okay to say no, that he didn't have to bend over backwards to please everyone around him. This wasn't just about romantic relationships anymore. It was about every interaction, every situation. For years, he had been conditioned to believe that to be a good person, he had to always put others first. But that was a lie. He had given so much of himself, and in the end, it had cost him more than he was ever willing to admit. Now, John realized that he couldn't pour from an empty cup. He had to fill himself up first, to nurture his own well-being before he could truly be there for anyone else. And this shift in mindset wasn't just liberating, it was transformative. His confidence grew, not because of anything external, but because he was no longer dependent on others' approval or validation. He knew that he was enough just as he was. One evening, as he sat on his porch, sipping a glass of bourbon, John thought about the future. He had spent so much time chasing the idea of what he thought life should be, but now, he was focused on what he actually wanted. He wasn't chasing after anyone's expectations anymore. He wasn't trying to live up to some idealized version of love or success. He was living life on his own terms, and that was more than enough. John had started to realize that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The validation he had once sought from others was no longer necessary. He wasn't looking for anyone to complete him because he was already complete. He understood now that the best relationships, the most fulfilling ones, are built on mutual respect and understanding. They are not about one person giving endlessly while the other takes without reciprocating. They are partnerships, where both people contribute, where both people give and receive in equal measure. And that was the kind of love John was now ready for. His heart was open, but it was guarded by the wisdom he had gained over the years. He wouldn't settle for less than what he deserved. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of being alone. He understood that solitude wasn't a weakness, but a strength. It gave him the space to grow, to heal, and to become the person he was meant to be. John knew that he was worthy of love, of respect, and of happiness, and he wasn't going to settle for anything less than that. As the months passed, John found himself in a better place emotionally, mentally, and physically. His relationships with others had improved because he was no longer giving away pieces of himself to those who didn't deserve them. His friendships became more meaningful, and he started to surround himself with people who valued him for who he was, not for what he could do for them. John's life had been filled with sacrifices, but now, it was filled with choices. He wasn't stuck in a pattern of endless giving without receiving. He was in control, and that sense of empowerment was priceless. He knew that the future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he was looking forward to it with hope and excitement. He was ready to face whatever came his way, knowing that he had the strength to handle it. The most important thing John had learned was that he didn't have to give everything to be worthy of love and respect. In fact, he had learned that in order to truly love and respect others, he had to first love and respect himself. And that was the greatest lesson of all. John Miller had come a long way. It wasn't just about healing anymore. It wasn't just about recovery or filling the void that had been left in his life after his marriage. Now, it was about living fully, embracing every moment, and learning to enjoy life on his own terms. He had learned the value of his own company, something he never thought possible after so many years of always being with someone else. John now understood that the journey was not about finding another person to fill the gaps. It was about discovering what made him truly happy, independent of anyone else. His days were no longer defined by what others expected of him. He had let go of the pressures that had once weighed him down, and in their place was a sense of peace that felt new and foreign. John began to see that he was more than just a provider, more than just a caretaker. He was his own person, with his own dreams, his own needs, and his own desires. And for the first time, he was going after those desires without guilt. He spent his time doing things he loved, pursuing hobbies that had always been pushed aside, and even starting new projects that excited him. He took long walks in the park, often stopping to admire the changing seasons, noticing things he had once overlooked. He began traveling, visiting places that had always been on his bucket list, but were always put off due to the responsibilities he once felt obligated to fulfill. And with every step he took, John felt more alive. But even as he embraced his newfound freedom, John remained open to the idea of love. He wasn't rejecting the possibility of a future partnership, but he was rejecting the idea that he had to sacrifice his happiness or peace for it. He had learned the hard way that love should not come at the expense of your own well-being. He wanted a relationship where both people gave and received equally, where both respected each other's individuality, and where neither person felt the need to sacrifice their happiness to make the other happy. John wasn't in a rush. He wasn't searching for someone to complete him, because he already felt complete. His life was full. But if love came again, he would welcome it with open arms, knowing that it would be different this time. It would be a love built on mutual respect and shared values. It would not be one-sided. John understood that he was worthy of love, respect, and happiness without having to give everything he had. He had already given enough, and now, it was time to focus on what he wanted, on what was best for him. This new approach to life wasn't about rejecting the past or resenting the mistakes he had made. It was about accepting those mistakes, learning from them, and using them as the foundation for a better future. John had learned the importance of self-care, of recognizing when he was giving too much and when he needed to take a step back. He had learned that taking care of himself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. And now, he was living his life in a way that honored his own needs first. His relationships with others had become healthier because he wasn't allowing himself to be drained anymore. He surrounded himself with people who valued him, who didn't take more than they gave. And that made all the difference. As the years went on, John felt more at peace with his choices. He wasn't worried about what others thought of him. He wasn't focused on meeting anyone else's expectations. He was living for himself, and that was all that mattered. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time, John was ready to embrace them. He wasn't afraid of being alone, because he knew that he was never truly alone. He had himself, and that was enough. His journey of self-discovery had been long and difficult, but it had led him to a place of inner peace and self-worth that he had never experienced before. He had learned that love, real love, wasn't about sacrifice. It wasn't about giving everything to someone else and losing yourself in the process. Real love was about balance, respect, and understanding. And now, John was ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that he was worthy of it all.